Okay, I see people joining. Good late afternoon, evening. It's wonderful to see many of you. Thank you so much for gathering on this snow day in many communities, including mine, which is low here. If you don't mind, please start to introduce yourselves in the chat so that we get to know you a little bit. Your name, pronoun, your role, and if you don't mind, district. If not, it's okay to also share. I come from a rural community, or I teach in an urban diverse community. Things like that is okay too, just as you're comfortable. All right, so while you're doing that, in respect of your time, I'm going to go get started. Good evening. I'm Kei Kawashima Ginsberg. I'm director of the Center for Information and Research on Civic Learning and Engagement, which is based at Tisch College of Civic Life at Tufts University. Our team, along with Ariel Techno-Wagner at Houston University and a team of interns, worked hard over the past year in collaboration with the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education to conduct an initial study of the state of civic education and implementation of the civics law and the framework. So with that, we will be presenting some key findings so that you have a shared understanding of what we found so far. But really our goal is to really hear from you and support your development of a plan as you start to or advance your implementation of the things that you're already doing in social studies and particularly in civic education across K-12 grades. Now, I'd like the rest of you to introduce yourselves. We have quite a few of us from the team, so we're supporting the webinar today. Maybe we'll start with Abby Kisa at Circle.
Hi, everyone. I'll be helping to facilitate one of the small groups. My name's Abby, and I'm Deputy Director at Circle.
Next up is maybe Ariel.
Hi, I'm Ariel Tigner-Wagner. I'm a faculty member at Boston University's Wheelock College of Education and Human Development.
And she's the PI of the study. And I'd like to Alex to introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Alex. I'm a former high school social studies teacher and now a graduate student in education policy, and I am a diverse democracy fellow at Circle.
And Nuria.
Hi, everyone. My name is Nuria Hayat. I'm a senior researcher at Circle.
And Ruben, please.
Hi there, I'm Ruben Henriquez. I am History and Social Science Content Lead at Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education.
And last but not least, Sarah, please.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. My name's Sarah Keese. I'm the project manager at Circle, and I'm working on this webinar as tech support. So if you have any questions or need help with the breakout rooms later on, please send me a chat.
Thank you. So we're a team about supporting this convening, but really, really glad to have you. I think we said this in invitation too, but this is the first and exciting first part of the three-part workshops, which this one would be focusing on really building awareness of what's going on in terms of what we found and thinking about how to connect with decision makers and educators like yourselves. The second workshop will be happening in between April, May of this year with a goal of thinking about following up with this convening today and thinking a little bit more about equitable implementation and what kind of concrete actions and planning can take place in order to meet the goals of the framework itself. And the final workshop will be focusing really at the beginning of this coming school year, believe it or not, after the summer, to really finalize what's happening with your planning and then get maybe exchange feedback. But we'll actually be designing these rest of the workshop with your inputs. So it's really important to sort of get your ideas and opinions and how things go from here. But we also would like that. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, Sarah's just going to put a poll to ask people when's a good time.
Yep.
To have these, so you should see the poll pop up.
Thank you. So the hope is that we can stay with you a little bit. We'll try to communicate maybe once a month. Just try to send some hello, how you doing? How can we help you? Maybe send some resources so that we're sort of with you, not meeting all the time, because I know you're very busy, but we're sort of around and available. And by the time the next school year rolls around, we hope to hear from you what's been working, what might be challenging, so that there's a little bit of a support for each other and from our team as well. Okay, so today's session will really focus on key findings, like I said, and there'll be a little bit of interactive component during that. We'll use Jamboard. I hope many of you have used it, but we'll make sure to explain how to use a little bit briefly. And then we'll have breakout groups that's going to focus on educators in the classroom. So everyone else, including administrators and other stakeholders, there may be some representative from professional development organizations, for example, they can join any group too, but making sure that we hear from teachers. I'll do the same. And then we'll have an elementary group, middle school educator group, and high school educator groups. We have a slightly different question for each of these groups. So I think it would be best if you try to think about who you talk to the most, who your stakeholders are. Alrighty. So with that, I'm going to move into talk really brief about the Circle's kind of ongoing work in civic education. All right. So you see a bunch of report front covers here, and it's really Circle's footprints, which is celebrating its 20th anniversary this year. And we've been sort of around, and from the time when we started to talk about best practices in civic education, believe it or not, there wasn't really national consensus on that. And that work in 2003 to C3 framework, which our former director was instrumental in developing, to more recent work that's been talking about expanding these basic best practices like direct instruction or controversial issue discussions to think more and more about how do we build inclusive classrooms and educational practices that can actually see and serve all kinds of students, not just students that look exactly like the teachers or centered on certain norms that's not for anymore, everybody. So that's the legacy here, and we're currently still working on big initiatives like Teaching for Democracy Alliance, which really hopes to support teachers who are trying to teach nonpartisan election and voting content in their classroom, and also Educating for American Democracy, which will be launching as a national project next month. And we'll definitely send you an invitation just to tell you what that's about and how you can be part of it. Next slide, please. So we have actually been the honor of unique expertise in following and evaluating implementation of state level civic education policies and then implementation design. We've so far spent about 3 to 4 years in Florida, now 5 years in Illinois, working alongside the team that's central to implementing these new ideas and practices in the state. So we've watched literally thousands of teachers trying to go and adopt these new practices with support of various stakeholders, whether it's a state folks or from professional development providers, and really honored to work in our own home state and now get to really work with you all to support you as much as we can, and also understand both for our own state, but also nationwide, how to make sure these best learning and lessons learned can be implemented in other states that are also working to implement these new laws. With that, I'm going to pass on to Ruben to talk a bit about the framework itself.
Sure. So I just want to take a few minutes to kind of set the stage for the research and explain the context of civics in Massachusetts. I see some familiar names and faces, so I know that this is a review for some of you. I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page as we kind of dig into the conversation tonight. So in 2018, there were a couple of different policy changes in the state that really altered the civic landscape. These were a culmination of work both from the legislature, from the Department of Education, as well as advocacy from the Massachusetts Civic Learning Coalition, which is a group of about 30 different civic education nonprofits. And so the first was the Chapter 296 of the Acts of 2018, which is an act to promote and enhance civic engagement. And this act established a civics trust fund. And then it also created a requirement that students be provided with a nonpartisan student-led civic action project once in 8th grade and then once in high school. And that requirement began this current school year. from DESE's end, 2018 also kind of marked the culmination of a review of the history and social science framework, which had last been updated in 2003. So we did kind of a top to bottom revision of the framework to place a higher emphasis on civic knowledge, skills, and dispositions at all grade levels, and including a grade 8 full year civics course. And then we also developed in October of 2019 a civics project guidebook that goes into a lot more detail on the expectations for those student-led civics projects that are laid out in the legislation. Go to the next slide. And so we talk a lot about this phrase civic knowledge, skills, and dispositions, and they're actually our first practice standard in the framework. So just to kind of get some definitions on the table, civic knowledge is that kind of content knowledge that a lot of us think about when we think about civics. What are the 3 branches of government? How does a bill become a law, et cetera? And we know that that's part of what civics is, but that's not all of what civic education should look like. So there's also then civic intellectual skills, which is sort of knowing how to identify, assess, describe, analyze different civic issues, as well as participatory skills, which is how to actually take action. How do you lobby a legislator? How do you gain support for your cause? How do you think strategically about making change in your community? As well as civic dispositions, which are more of the values or the virtues or habits of mind, like respect for others, commitment to equality, capacity for listening, et cetera, that are really important to being part of a community with people of different opinions and different backgrounds. And the guiding principles of that framework really sort of anchor our instruction from grades pre-K all the way up through 12. And they lay out kind of a number of focuses that we think are essential to high quality history and social science education, which includes focus on critical, inclusive, and culturally responsive instruction, making sure that students have history instruction or social studies instruction all the way from pre-K up through 12th grade, interdisciplinary learning, so connections to art and English and science, development of students' critical thinking, and then development of their social emotional skills as well. I also mentioned earlier that civics project guidebook, and this is where we go into a little bit more detail about some of the key defining characteristics that we really think should undergird the civic projects to help develop those knowledge, skills, and dispositions. And these principles really clarify that the intent of the project is to involve students in real world, goal-driven kind of systems analysis, rather than just a more surface level community service. They also make explicit the tie to the inquiry arc from generating questions, doing research, all the way up to taking informed action, and move students through these kind of 6 stages of action taking that are really closely tied to that process of historical inquiry. And those 6 stages, along with the defining characteristics or the pedagogical principles that you see here, are kind of the anchoring concepts that we use to ground our professional development and help define the expectations for teachers as they work to implement the civics projects that are required by the law.
Okay, we have a short exercise on Jamboard. Sarah's just posting the link in the chat to talk about what is your familiarity and comfort with some of the stuff that Ruben just talked about the history and social science framework and the inquiry arc that's named. So please go to the Jamboard and go to your respective slides. So there are slides for elementary and secondary teachers and administrators and anyone else, and kind of take a sticky note and show us what level of familiarity you have as a quick glance before we move on with our presentation.
Just a quick question. The Jamboard is in the chat, by the way, but do you want us to put like a marker dot around the number, or do you want us to just enter a number?
Yeah, if you can put like 1 to 5 on one side and 5 to 10 on one side, I think it'll help people quickly see where you are. I'm just going to screen share so folks can see as well.
Thanks.
So yes, if you can take a sticky note and kind of either write or take a sticky note on the side and put a number on, that'll help us get a sense very quickly. Okay.
I see actually good variations and also good spread on the roles. So that's great. We have a good presentation here.
Yep. Okay. All right. I'm going to stop this and move on to our presentation. You can keep adding to it as we go back to our presentation. And we start with Ariel.
Great, thank you. So thank you all for coming tonight. So essentially, I'm going to take a few minutes to share some of the findings from the study that the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education contracted myself and my great collaborators here at Circle to do, essentially to lead a study understanding what the state of civic education is in Massachusetts as it relates to all the new policies that Ruben just discussed. So at the eve of this new legislation being required, we measured the baseline in Massachusetts educators' awareness and implementation of the framework and student-led civic projects, and whether there was any systematic variation based on teaching context, such as geographic location, demographics of students served, and grade level. So in other words, we asked where are educators starting from and how can they best be supported to ensure successful implementation of these new civics requirements. And our findings are based on a survey we developed and piloted on civic teachers teaching self-reported civic teaching competency. We got responses from over 500 classroom teachers and over 100 decision makers, and also conducted 40 follow-up interviews with educators. And this all took place between June and July of 2020. And importantly, our survey and interview participants represented a cross-section of teachers of different grade levels across K through 12 from different geographic parts of Massachusetts and teaching in districts with varying proportions of socioeconomic, racial, and linguistic diversity. So while there are many detailed and important findings in the report, which I'll encourage you to read with the free time I know many of you probably don't have, Nori and I will take the next few minutes to share some of the key high-level findings. So overall, our preliminary findings show promising signs of equitable implementation. Not only do the new policies prioritize equity, but our baseline findings show that teacher familiarity with civics policies and self-reported civic teaching competency did not vary by district level demographics. So rather it was resources and supports such as professional development and district per pupil expenditure that were correlated with teaching civic competency skills. However, we did find that the current implementation of and competence in teaching civics as articulated in the framework, and that's required across grades K through 12, was much lower across our 4 elementary school teachers. So we'll take a deeper dive into each of these points. Next slide. And just real fast, when we do talk about civic teaching competency, we are referring to these domains that you see here on the slides that are reflected throughout the history and social science framework. Next slide. Yes, our findings. Teachers do value the type of civics learning that the new policies espouse and have at least heard of the framework. However, we did find a much smaller percentage of teachers reporting understanding how the framework directly applies to their own instruction. And furthermore, we did find awareness based on grade level taught. So 20% of elementary teachers reported knowing how the framework could influence their instruction versus 65% of middle and high school teachers. We also found for middle and high school teachers, they reported greater familiarity with the history and social science framework as compared to the new civics project legislation. Next slide. And importantly, we found no differences in civic policy awareness by district level demographics, including geographic region, the percent of enrolled students with economic disadvantage, the percent of non-white students and white students, and the percentage of students who are classified as English learners. I will emphasize this is at the district level. And some qualitative interview data did point to within school disparities, which we'll turn to next. So Nora.
Right. So as Ariel said, you know, we saw that across between districts, we didn't see any significant difference, but we do know from our talking to teachers and administrators that there are disparities in civic learning across your school, across districts, in your classroom. So take a minute to go to the Jamboard link that Sarah must have posted in the chat. And if you can let us know some examples that pop to your mind that, you know, particularly at this time, show disparities in civic learning. And I'll screen share those so we have an idea of that too. So like last time, please go to the slide that corresponds to your grade level or your role and, you know, take a sticky note and let us know some of the disparities you do see in your work right now. I see people are posting. Yeah, we've seen the virtual versus hybrid come up a lot of times. And the resources to mobilize, yes. Yeah, I see a lot of things that we're going to talk about in our breakout groups as well. And you'll see some of these come up later as in the presentation too. Yeah, the pandemic has led into a lot of challenges, and we kind of conducted this study during the pandemic too, and we asked teachers specifically, you'll see this, what their teaching was like before pandemic and how they were including civics and what are the challenges now. And Ariel and I will talk about that more. Okay, please continue posting because we really want to have a discussion. I will move us back to the presentation and you can keep posting this and we can come back to this at the end after our breakout group discussions as well. All right, Ariel.
Great. So yeah, so thank you all for posting and sharing, because I think, you know, we all think it's important, you know, to kind of recognize that, you know, that there are disparities, right, that we might be seeing kind of in our classrooms, at the school level, right, that sometimes our data, right, can't get at. So I'm looking forward to more of those conversations. So we did find, as I already alluded to, that that secondary teachers, so middle and high school teachers, did report more awareness and overall implementation of civics than elementary school teachers. And you know, this particularly kind of came when it came to our skills around civic content, along with discussions. You know, we did find as well that 2/3 of middle and high school teachers are teaching civics in a required course, either standalone or integrated in another course. And prior to, so remember we collected this data last summer before the civics projects were actually required. And we found about, a quarter of middle school and high school teachers reporting that they have already implemented student-led civic projects. However, we also found that the majority of teachers also were not frequently practicing all steps of the inquiry arc that the framework and the civic projects lays out. And compared to secondary teachers, elementary school teachers did score higher on skills related to interdisciplinary learning and creating a student-centered climate, yet lower, as I said, on skills related to kind of content related to government and controversial issue discussions. So this, suggests that modeling and teaching about being good citizens may be happening, but there's less teaching about concepts related to civic content. And importantly, 20% of elementary school teachers reported that they did not have any dedicated time, for social studies, right? Never mind civics. And so that they were kind of taking that time for teaching civics by integrating it into English language arts. So the next slide does begin to show that this breakdown of how elementary school teachers are integrating civics, given the fact that they don't have a lot of hours allocated in their schedule to teach social studies or civics. So you can see from this graph that the majority of elementary school teachers who took our survey incorporated civics into literacy or English language arts, or students' everyday experiences, right? About half integrated civics into a theme in social studies. And then the next slide shows, so kind of going back to the student-led civics projects, that most middle and high school teachers who took our survey had at least begun planning for student-led civics projects, and 21% of middle school and 11% of high school teachers had not yet begun planning, with about 10% in each kind of grade band reporting that they were unsure. So while about a quarter had begun implementing or had fully implemented student-led civics projects as of last summer, a good majority, had also, begun at least the planning steps too. And then kind of, corroborating this, most administrators reported, as of last summer that most students were not participating in student-led civics projects. And I think it's interesting as well to note that 47% of the administrators who took our survey noted that they were unsure of whether or not students were participating or not in the 8th grade as well. And so as this quote shows, and I'll give folks a moment to read it, that teachers do need support and preparation to teach civics in our hyperpolarized society. And as you look at this quote, I'll add that in our survey and in interviews, teachers really are asking for more support, specifically for more framework aligned and civics project aligned professional development and curricular resources. And I'll turn it over to Nuria to begin discussing some of the professional development opportunities.
Thank you. Thank you, Ariel. So yeah, in the same line, I mean, we saw when we surveyed teachers that overall 2 in 5 teachers have never had any PD that's focused on civics. And this was even higher for elementary teachers, half of which said that they had not received any PD. And more than 1 in 3 secondary teachers said they had not received any civics focused PD either. And teachers who had received PD, you can see only about 16% received it once a year. And going back to Ariel's point where, we found out that elementary teachers felt less supported and prepared to integrate civics than secondary teachers, but overall we did see that a lot of teachers did say they did not have enough time to incorporate civics, and there was too much pressure to incorporate other content. Elementary teachers were also more likely to say that they did not have access to training that would develop their skills of teaching civics and integrating civics more so, almost twice as much as secondary teachers. And then we had a separate administrator survey as well, where we asked administrators about their perceptions of how teachers were incorporating civics in their schools, and about 6 in 10 of them said that teachers did integrate civics specific content and help students research issues from multiple sources. So they thought teachers were proficient to do that. About half of the administrators also thought that teachers could facilitate inquiry-based learning and inquiry cycles and facilitate controversial issue discussions. Where administrators thought teachers struggled the most was with providing students with opportunities to share their work with authentic audiences. And this was before the pandemic. So this is not due to the pandemic. And this is one of the areas that administrators highlighted they thought that teachers struggled with. One of the most important findings of our study in Massachusetts, and what corroborates years of our research that Kay talked about earlier as well, is that supporting teachers through resources, and particularly through professional development, increases their confidence and efficacy to teach and integrate civics. Our study in Massachusetts also showed that professional development helped boost teacher confidence, and this predicted teachers' competency to teach civics, especially in the competencies that Ariel showed earlier. And if you read the report, we got a lot of great examples of teachers incorporating civics across from K to 12, and how they were doing civics projects as well. This was one teacher from an upper elementary grade that shared this with us. So teachers do have the skills and confidence to support student-led inquiry, but we did find out that a lot of teachers had to self-initiate and reach out for these PD and resources themselves. So they didn't feel like there was a targeted effort to get PD to them, especially civics-focused PD. So like I said, the pandemic had hit by the time we rolled out the study, and we asked teachers particular challenges that they were facing in the pandemic, and you shared some of that in the Jamboard as well. 6 out of 10 teachers at that time said, we're not prioritizing civics at this time. Student engagement and remote learning is really hard. There is, there's not enough sometimes issues with access to technology at that time, or students are not at an emotional space to have the discussions in a civics classroom. It's difficult to build that kind of trust and climate in either all remote learning or a hybrid learning space. And then there was, again, too much pressure to cover other content areas that were, are usually tested more than civics. We did hear about some successes from teachers who said that instead of making it more subject specific, they use that space for more focus on social emotional learning and incorporating student voice, and tying that to current events that were happening in the community broadly. And we were talking to teachers during June and July. So a lot of Black Lives Matter protests or George Floyd protests had broken out by then. So a lot of teachers then used this space, either remotely or otherwise, to talk about issues that were, students were facing at the time. And I'll let Kay take over and talk about our overall findings.
Okay, so we'll just take a, thank you, Naria and Ariel. Take a couple minutes to just really quickly overview what we just talked about, right? So the initial findings were there is a far more awareness of the framework and civics project than the actual application so far, especially with a focus on elementary grades having a lot more trouble. The majority of administrators seem to have both confidence in teachers' capacity, but also a lot more need in some areas, specifically with certain things. And building confidence through PD does improve instruction. That's reported by teachers, kind of specific practices that we talked about. And they kind of talk about these practices like, this is what I do on a regular basis. So we're really thinking about the habits building as opposed to knowing about certain practices. What we did find as probably one of the most problematic issue is still that the PD is really not getting to most teachers at sufficient frequency. So we consider once a year as one of the cutoffs, but if you really think about how hard it is to teach civics, especially today in pandemic, in this political climate, it's certainly not enough. So we're really looking at a small slice of teachers that gets more than once a year. We also found that the different grade bands has different assets and different needs. And again, all of us probably need training. So with elementary, it's about content and inquiry. More time would be great. And with secondary, it seems that the kind of the knowledge of the content is already there, but now they can deepen the practice around building inclusive classroom climate that can sustain really great and rigorous inquiries that might be about some of the difficult issues that arise in a society or in a history, and also using culturally responsive pedagogy. There's a lot more need, it seems, for high quality framework aligned and great differentiated resources and training. So there's a lot of great conversations going on, just to make you guys feel a little bit better, among the professional community in civics here in Massachusetts, to really think about how do we align ourselves and our training much more tightly to the framework now that this study's out and now that there's more demands from teachers. So you really matter in asking for more aligned and grade appropriate resources rather than just receiving curriculum and not seeing applications directly. The other thing that we seem to kind of heard through qualitative portion of this is the peer leadership and peer-to-peer support, as well as school administrator support, is really important part of implementing civic education rigorously and with high integrity. Last slide, please, on this one. So really, some of the big findings related to elementary education really cannot be emphasized enough. I partly say this because we studied Florida's middle school centered civic education rollout really closely. And what we found was that there was so much focus sometimes on middle school that they neglected elementary almost entirely, though the law did have framework and even some requirements for elementary school. It's really important that we build, especially for English learner students and for diverse immigrant students and other students that don't have that civic socialization at home, to have that grounding in elementary grades, so that you welcome students in middle school, 8th grade, they have the concepts and the idea of what it's like to be an engaged citizen of the community and the world. So there needs to be a lot more support. So those were our recommendations. And I think we're ready to take questions from all of us.
Yes. Please type your questions in the chat, and Kay will start taking some and throwing out to presenters as well. And we do have limited time because we'll be going into breakout groups soon, but we will be saving the chat and we can reach out to you, or you can email us and we'll follow up, but we'll definitely follow up if we don't get to all the questions.
Yeah, and Jason, thank you for sharing the presence of MA Civics Teachers Facebook. That's great. Please share how to sign up for that for those of you that are interested, maybe.
Yeah, let me go to the, we were going to share this at the end, but I can't show the resources slide right now as well for teachers while we take the questions. So Ruben, do you want to talk about a bit about the implementation forums and the curriculum advisors?
Absolutely. So this is a good segue because we just talked about some of the recommendations around professional development and helping identify high quality resources. And so we have a couple of things from Desi's end that are actually coming up very soon. So one is that throughout the spring, we have a series of virtual support forums focused really on implementing those student-led civics projects. They're all facilitated by teachers who have done the projects in the past and who are doing them currently in their own classrooms. So that kind of peer-to-peer sharing, they're going to be doing some, sharing their own resources, helping folks work through their own problems. Our first one's tomorrow afternoon, focused on the logistics and planning for the process, but then there's some on controversial issue discussions, checking with stakeholders, et cetera. And so those are open sign up, and I can drop the link in the chat once I'm done. And then we also have an opportunity for civics teachers to apply to be curriculum teacher advisors. We're working with the Rennie Center to do a review of grade 8 civics materials and sort of help elevate the ones that are really the most standards aligned, high quality, culturally responsive, et cetera. And looking for teachers to help do that work. There's great PD involved as well as a $1,000 stipend. So it's a really exciting opportunity. And applications are open now, and we're accepting them on a rolling basis through February 24th.
That's great.
Thank you so much.
really quickly, and I think others can definitely jump in. There is a question from Jason about how can we relate to districts to better prioritize the need for time and PD devoted to social studies and civics in particular. So it's a really great point. So one of the things that we know from Illinois that actually worked was to actually help administrators in particular understand how teaching great civics actually lets teachers become better teachers. And it also meets some of the other mandates. So in particular in Illinois, they had social emotional learning standards in place already. They also had the Nielsen framework, which is about interactive teaching strategies. Those were used as teacher evaluation tool. So I don't know what's in place in Massachusetts, but there's oftentimes already the things that schools and districts have to do that happen to overlap with really our well-written framework in history and social science. I'm very proud of our framework. I didn't have any hands in that, many of the teachers did, but I think it's really based on best practices in education generally. So that's one of the things that has worked there. Others?
Yeah, just piggybacking off of that, I think kind of the need for just building awareness, right? Kind of among district administrators of what's going on, right? So even sharing, hey, here's the framework, these are these professional developments. Well, of course, we would love it for kind of those to come from the district as well, right? And not be, as we found a lot of teachers were self-initiating, kind of the PD that we found, but to be able, I think, as a start to kind of help create that awareness and is another really important facet as well. So one of the recommendations we have, right, is about kind of providing or there being, you know, professional development for administrators too.
Yeah.
I would just also quickly add that I think that teachers really take their lead from administrators in this a lot. If they sense that their leadership is behind them when they're talking about current events and controversial issues, they will feel much more comfortable doing that in their classroom. And something else that's come up in some of our civics networks with teachers this fall is that actually these are some of the things that can make schools look really good. And if we can get administrators excited about, you know, this sorts of civic action that students are doing, these are the things that, you know, go on school social media pages and kind of help, you know, show the great work that they're doing to the community. And there's sort of that potential to get administrators not only accepting of this, but really excited and enthusiastic about student-led civic action.
Thank you for that.
I
Okay,
think
so
we have
think
2 or 3 minutes to take more questions.
okay, there is a question. I think it's a little bit hard to answer this, but maybe we'll test this out. Is there a recommended amount of classroom and after school hours to complete a comprehensive civics project for high schoolers? Who wants to take that?
I can take that. This is a question that we
Great.
get a lot. We don't have an official recommendation. I think that we're definitely, you know, seeing all sorts of different models, and it depends somewhat on, you know, what are you doing it all at once? Are you doing it throughout the semester? And we sort of have talked to teachers who do it different ways. What we've seen is kind of the absolute minimum. I think if you try to, you know, do it all from start to finish, sort of every single day, is at least 3 weeks. To get through kind of the full 6 stages, and even that can feel pretty abbreviated just because, you know, some of the reaching out and taking action takes time to hear back from stakeholders, to put pieces together. And so, you know, I think you can sort of spread that out and have less in-class time, but know that there's waiting, you know, to hear back, or there's homework or things students are doing outside of class. But kind of, I would say 3 weeks is like the minimum that it would take.
Thank you. I
one
know
more
we
question
have
before we go
one
to
more
the-
question. Okay. Let's see, there is, you know, really understandable challenge, which is that it's really social studies get a lot of short end of the stick. It gets cut right away. We don't test it. There are different probably challenges and solutions to different grades, but do you want to say anything about this, Ruben?
I mean, yeah, I would just echo that what's coming up in the chat, that we know that social studies often gets the short end of the stick, and I think that we see every day the consequences of that for our democracy. It's a challenge, and it's one that I'm, you know, I as someone at DESE am always very curious to talk to teachers about, and I'm open to folks' thoughts here, because on the one hand, there's this tension of, we aren't an MCAS subject, and so we're not tested. But I think there's very few teachers who say, yes, what we want is an MCAS in social studies in every single grade, right? Or even, I think a lot of teachers don't want an MCAS at all. And so I think this comes up in your report too. What are sort of creative accountability measures to kind of put that sort of push and send the message to schools that this is important and this is not a negotiable subject, but in a way that teachers can get on board with and that feels like it's supporting your work rather than kind of adding one more burden to you. And I think we're still trying to figure that out, and definitely open to creative ideas from you all as well.
I wonder too. So I do see, I was working with, I think, Donuts Choose that supported Teacher Civics project recently, and I got to like judge some of the great ideas, and many of them are interdisciplinary, I would say. So I do wonder about, especially in lower grade, if there are opportunities like that where students are, for example, really exploring, the natural environment around their school, or something about the soil contamination in my community. I used to find needles all over my community garden, right? So these are the kind of things that are in their everyday lives, and then tie that to social issues while also building some disciplinary skills, whether it's science or some other subject area. So I think there are some of these great examples that I wish we could really share out in a broader way. I think that's part of what MCLC is hoping to do as well.
Okay, we're still getting a lot of questions, and you can have those discussions. One of us is facilitating breakout groups, so you can have a lot of questions there. And I think Ruben is going to pop in and out of rooms as well if you have questions for him. For the next almost 30 minutes, we're trying to have breakout groups by educators, grade level, to talk about what does civic education aligned with the framework look like for each and every student. And we have a Jamboard and a few slides to walk through this. Like I said, the way we've designed the breakout groups is by educator level, so elementary, middle, and high school. For everyone else, we really want to center teachers here. Please pick one of these rooms where you work with the teacher group the most, or you want to hear out what teachers are saying, and we'll be facilitating a discussion over there. We want to hear out what teachers want, what they need, and what they want to discuss. And Sarah's just going to post the groups in the chat. You should see, and you should be able to self-select one of these groups. So we're asking teachers to select their group and everyone else to select the group that they'd prefer to go to in like a minute, if you can. Hi, everyone. We're just gonna wait for 30 seconds for everyone to come back. And then I'm going to ask the facilitators to take 2 minutes and share either their Jamboards or just highlights of their discussions. And Kay, we'll start with you.
Okay, and I apologize, I'm not showing my face. My power went out, so I'm pitch dark and a little creepy, so I'm gonna just hide myself.
Okay.
I hope you can hear me. So our group decided to just talk because that's what the room needed, and it was really, really wonderful to hear from everybody. Thank you, Erin and Sarah and Lisa. So we heard a lot about kind of how, especially as a teacher coach, which is kind of what the room was largely, there's a lot of need for supporting teachers who still feel like there's a lack of skill in themselves. And then there's also sort of shifts in curriculum, whether it's because they adapted a new curriculum or because somebody was switching districts. There's a lot of adjustment period where different things have been in place in different schools in the past. So now that the framework is out too, there's a lot of different resources to build on, but also challenges in figuring out where the district is at right now, and then meeting their teachers where they are. Another interesting and important part of the conversation had to do with how to integrate some of the things that are already in the air of the district. It could be social emotional learning. In some places, it might have been this restorative justice, in addition to social emotional learning, and how much asset that can be for teaching of social studies and in supporting students, especially in remote settings, but also as they move forward. So those are the gist of the conversation. The last part of the conversation ended with sort of how much there is a limit to demanding the elementary teachers somehow fit in civics content and social studies content while we're not making structural changes to the time allocation. That reality is not likely to change in elementary teaching, where some teachers might describe their day as quite scripted, or just so much time spent on ELN math and so many requirements attached to those subject areas. So there was kind of so much they can keep doing before it's still not enough. So there is sort of a challenge that still isn't answered. So I'll stop there.
All right, thank you, Kay. Ariel, could you share with your middle school group?
Yeah, so I'll just kind of talk through, I guess, some of the main kind of themes that we discussed. So my wonderful group of Adam and Haley and Kevin, we jumped right in as a middle school group, jumped right into the student-led civics projects. And I think kind of a big theme is just kind of the variation and vastness, right, of what these projects entail. So we shared some good examples of kind of how how teachers are tackling student-led civics projects. So starting out with, for example, like a whole group project, or perhaps only, kind of 2 different projects to keep things keep things not too overwhelming. And in addition, Kevin had the great insight of, after his first year implementing them towards the end of the year and kind of trying to cram it all in, actually kind of spreading it out into smaller increments throughout the year. So kind of taking a smaller proportion of class time over a longer period of time to address them. Because one of the biggest constraints, particularly this year, is the issue of time, right? That there's just simply not enough time in the schedule to do everything and cover everything. So there's also kind of some variation in whether it was kind of a whole class project that everyone's doing during class time, or also just opting in after school in the event that there's just not enough time. So kind of there's kind of some of this tension of how to actually integrate it in. And when it comes to actual kind of supports and resources needed for supporting these student-led civics projects, a lot of it is around, needing a specific vision and kind of, it's kind of specific goals that can be measurable and examples, particularly at the middle school level, of what expectations should be for these projects. In addition to just, simply providing resources such as, folders and notebooks and things that kids can actually do the work in. And a good piece of advice as well is just constantly reminding kids that they're in charge of what they're doing. And it's a great change for students for them to have the opportunity to make a difference, right, during the school day.
All right, thank you so much, Ariel. Abby, do you want to take us to the next middle school group?
Yeah, we, our great group of Sarah and Ati, Gary, and Jay, we had mostly a conversation because it was middle school about the student-led projects. And from the get-go had a conversation about how much is involved in not only the projects, but also making them truly inclusive. The scaffolding that's needed, someone pointed out, for example, that they're graphic organizers to make, the fact that there has to be vocabulary talked about. And one of the things that we talked about for a good long time, because it's that important, was how to get responses from people who the students are reaching out to in the community, and different angles to that. So our group really felt like the project can take up a lot of time, and that it's really difficult to fit in 2-3 weeks. But that people started to talk about the different types of projects. Had a wonderful sort of community-based person in our group, Ati, talking about their work with young people doing advocacy and the options for doing advocacy that's not necessarily directed at getting a direct response and dependent on that. So we talked a good bit about that. We also talked about the idea of really helping teachers come together with PD providers for an intensive, as something as that like an IB or an AP teacher would get before they start teaching something. So it's a deep dive into it. and might be great for administrators to come to and even legislators so that they can see how deep this is, how important it is. And could be a bunch of networking to build all the social capital that are needed for these projects.
Thank you, Abby. And Christian, Peter, and I from Circle also connected with ATI students a few weeks ago, so that was really heartening. Okay, Alex, do you want to share something from your high school group, and then I'll share from ours?
Yeah, of course. So a lot of what we talked about has sort of been touched on already. We absolutely talked about sort of time as a barrier and how do you make sure that students are getting responses from people that they're reaching out to, and what does it mean to sort of like build confidence and civic agency through projects and through a lot of this sort of social studies work. We thought a lot about how you incorporate civic learning into sort of multidisciplinary learning in various classroom settings. And that it's been really hard to engage, especially in some of the civics learning in the virtual format, given just how many sort of socio-emotional barriers that students are facing right now. In terms of like strategies and resources that would be helpful for students, we talked about sort of examples of projects would be really helpful, and how to do this, especially in the virtual format, like lists of organizations that students can contact and that are responsive to young people who are reaching out to them. And then we also talked about how there's sort of a challenge for teachers, especially in regards to these projects, where not only are you working to sort of like design frameworks to implement the projects in your classroom, but then you're also working to manage a variety of student-led projects, knowing that, you know, teachers are not experts necessarily in every topic that their students are interested in pursuing, right? And so what does it mean for teachers to manage a variety of topics and projects and sort of learn along with their students, but still be able to facilitate that learning for their students?
Okay. Yeah, that echoes some of what we saw, but my big takeaway from our awesome group was, you know, teachers are really incorporating this student-led or project-based learning more than ever now in the pandemic, because I kept asking, what are you doing? What are the challenges in the pandemic? And a lot of teachers said we're actually moving towards this a lot. Alicia shared that, you know, they also work with performance assessments a lot this year. What I saw, I think one of my takeaways from that was also that schools that had laid the groundwork to do this work were able to pick this up this year and plan for the next years too. So teachers or schools that had worked together to lay the foundation for having such discussions or having such action civics move towards that more quickly than others from what we've seen. And then to your point, I think Alex and Abby also touched that exemplars would really help, but also guidance, and because, you know, step-by-step guidance on how to include projects in your classroom, helping teachers wherever they are. So not just a good end product, but wherever they are in the implementation phase would help. Having like simplified templates of what the guidebook says about implementation would also help. And we actually saw this in Illinois as well. There were some really, really good ideas that PD providers came up with in sessions, but once the lead teacher that was working with other teachers in partnerships broke it down into simplified forms for teachers to actually like implement step by step, that's where you know, most successful implementation started happening over the years. And then folks also pointed out in my group that teachers need clearer parameters around the projects and what that entails, and working with other teachers or PD providers in partnership to do that would also help. Did I miss anything, or does anyone want to chip in and add anything over here? Okay. Thank you so much, everyone. We're right at time, and thank you for joining us on a snowy evening in Massachusetts, at least, and with power outage. Sarah just posted links to all our resources, including the report, both the Massachusetts one and the Illinois one. If you have any questions, reach out to us, to me, to Sarah, to any of the Circle folks, or to Ariel. And like we said, this is a series of workshops, so we have 2 others planned, and would really like your feedback. This was more around, okay, this is the research we did, this is what we talked about, here's what we're sharing, and it's more, you know, awareness building. But we really want this to be helpful to folks, and teachers and administrators across Massachusetts. So we will be following up with you, and see if we can answer any other questions you've had. Great. I'll stick around for another 5 minutes for any other questions, but thank you so much, everyone, for joining. I really am grateful for the space.
Thank you so much, and stay safe and warm. Bye, everyone.